Welcome to this oral history interview, part of the developing series of interviews focusing on live music venues and experiences on Route 66, centered around Springfield and Greene County, Missouri, and Lebanon and Pulaski County, Missouri. This series is supported in part by a grant from the Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program of the National Park Service. My name is Craig Amason with Missouri State University Libraries. Today's date is March 6th. 2023, and our special guests today are Irv Logan and Elizabeth Logan Calvin. Irv and Elizabeth are the grandchildren of Alberta Ellis, an amazing entrepreneur in the Springfield area in the mid-20th century who owned and operated a hotel and a cafe in town that serviced all races, including African Americans, during the time of segregation along Route 66. Mr. Logan worked in his grandmother's hotel as a teenager. Miss Ellis also owned the farm, a 10-acre property west of Springfield on Route 66 with a roadside park that also served as lodging business for travelers on the Mother Road. She even owned a nightclub west of town, also on Route 66, called the Crystal Lounge. I think that's correct. Or the Palace, Crystal Palace. This interview today is taking place at the historic Timmons Hall at Silver Springs Park here in Springfield, Missouri. Thank you both so much for agreeing to participate in this project and for talking with us today.
Thank you.
First question, were you both born in Springfield?
Yes.
Yes.
And do you care to tell us dates?
Yeah, I was born on July the 11th, 1944.
February 10th, 1946.
Thank you. Your grandmother, Alberta Northcutt Ellis, was a remarkable businesswoman. She worked for the Southwestern Bell Telephone Company in Springfield, but as an entrepreneur, she was savvy in recognizing demand and how to supply it. Mm-hmm. Her enterprises included hotels, a cafe, music venues, and rental houses. She also rented out space in her hotel for other service-oriented businesses. For the purposes of this project, we are especially interested in the musical acts she was hosting at the Rumpus Room at the downtown hotel and at the Crystal Lounge west of town. But before we get into specifics, tell us how you would describe the live music scene in Springfield in the 1950s and 60s.
From what we would know as children.
Yeah.
Well, the 60s, we have a good idea. You talk.
Well, actually, my fondest memories of the music scene in Springfield actually started with one of my father's brothers, James Logan, who was part of a group called the Philharmonics.
Yes.
And when we lived at my great-great-grandfather's house on Sherman Street, actually, we lived between my mom and dad's house on Clay Street and my grandmother's house on Sherman and the hotel. So over a period of time, we lived in several different places. But when we were on Springfield, or when we were on Sherman Street, the grand old, I guess they call it the Ozark Jubilee,
yes,
had a place at the corner of Chestnut and Sherman. And it used to be, in my mind, it looks like an old wooden structure with a long porch out front. And there used to be all kinds of musicians of all races who would come by there and practice and play.
It was like a studio?
It was like a studio. I didn't spend much time inside of it. I was just a kid. But I just remember that there were just a multitude of people who would come there and play instruments and sing. And of course, they from there would come out to Alberta's hotel once that she acquired that and got it all started. So my fondest memories of that time are of those people, Red Foley and some of the other people, Brenda Lee. We used to play with her on the front porch at that time back in the day. And there were other musicians lesser known to me that were there that I would later see at the I guess they called it what did they call that music venue. Was that on Jefferson?
Yeah. Right at the Jewel Theater.
The Jewel Theater, right. And so I would see them on TV in the 50s.
Right. And how did that feel to see people that you knew on television, national television? Yeah,
television was so new at that time that I remember we had a color TV, and that color TV was a round screen, and it had 3 colors and a laminate that went over it, so that every now and then it would all line up perfect, and it would look like, wow, the sky's blue, the grass is green, and, and you'd see the musicians. And so then after that, what I remember is that some of the Beadles, David Beadle had a drum shop, and so there would be musicians coming through there also.
And I as I think about it, I do remember some of the local musicians like Dallas Bartley, Bebop Brown.
Oh yeah.
I don't want to miss anybody, but those are the names that come right away to me that I remember like as a child, because they were always around.
That's true.
They were always around. They were always around playing music in different venues and at the hotel. So.
And were they playing in the neighborhood as well?
Yeah, from what I remember.
They did.
We have heard that. Right.
Yep. So we were all familiar with who they were, and that that they were musicians.
Yeah. So music for you, as you were growing up, wasn't something that was happening elsewhere, like on the coasts or something.
Oh no.
It was right here.
Right. And it was a mix of music. I mean, there was I guess you would call it country and western, and there was blues, and there was the beginnings of rock and roll.
And even gospel with the Philharmonics.
And gospel with the Philharmonics.
Right.
Yeah,
but it was really something to see your uncle and the other Philharmonics on television at the time when, we were first all getting televisions. And so, there's Uncle James.
Yeah.
There was Moss,
yeah.
Chick.
Yeah.
Who was the other one?
Homer.
And there was somebody else at one point.
Yeah, that was
There was
Mr.
Homer
Culps.
Boyd. Yeah, Mr. Culps. So, and we knew them. They were all like family. I mean, our families were together at different points of time, whether it was picnics in the park or, playing games or whatever. You knew them. It's like, there they are on television again.
I have to ask, did that give you some sort of credibility among your schoolmates and so forth? I mean, that you.
Well, it was all family. I mean, we all,
So you're going to school with the same people that they all know.
Right. Yeah,
and we all went to church together.
We all went to church.
So you knew each other.
Yeah.
Right. So the music community was the community too.
It was the community.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right.
Good way to put it.
So music was a big part of
it was
growing up. Sure.
Well, just to show you just how big a part it was, during the days of segregation at Lincoln, they had a big band, a full band, and Homer Boyd was, in my days, which were the last days of segregation, Homer Boyd was the drum major.
Yeah.
And, he was very, he was influenced greatly by his mentor, who was Mr. Foster, who later became, after he left Lincoln, he went to Florida A&M University. And if you look at the historically black college bands now, Mr. Foster was the greatest influence on all of that. And it's still there today. I mean, when you go to see a halftime show at a historically black college, the
halftime
show is, almost
as
primary.
As good as the football.
As good as the football.
Better than the football.
Right. Because of the way that it was structured and put on. And a lot of that started here in Springfield with Mr. Foster. And people from all races would come to see Lincoln perform.
Yeah, so there were a lot of seeds planted in Springfield.
A lot of seeds.
Sprouted all over the country.
Nashville owes a lot to Springfield.
Tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, it's just that, the Ozark Jubilee that started here with Red Foley and all that whole crew, eventually you see what happened in Nashville. And from Nashville, look where we are today. And now it's hard to tell a lot of times the difference between what was traditional country music and what is blues and rock and roll and popular music today. It's hard to tell.
And wasn't the Ozark Jubilee the first nationwide TV program?
Country music television show, and the only one broadcast outside the coasts too.
That's true.
The country.
Yeah. So there was a lot of activity going on here in Springfield at that time, as far as the music scene was concerned.
And thinking back to that time, were you aware of that?
No, not really. I mean, you know, in the sense that it would grow into something that it is today. No, it was just, you know, I don't know how to describe that. You know, it's like in Louisiana, the Creole and Cajun music down there was something that developed out of that culture. Well, the country and western and blues music developed out of our culture here and south of here in Arkansas, Mississippi, Georgia. And, you know, it sort of came together here because we are in the Midwest. We're in the middle of all of it.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's said that we get things last because it comes in from the from the coast. But a lot of things here develop a way of being of their own. And that's what happened here. And then it goes back out. So literally, Nashville grew out of what happened here in the Ozarks, the way I see it.
But keep in mind, because we were right on Route 66, all of the musicians that were traveling, let me say African-American musicians traveling from east to west or west to east, they were coming through Springfield. And if you're driving or in a bus or in a car, you know, you've got to stop somewhere. So one of the places where you stopped was in Springfield and at Alberta's Hotel or at Grimm's.
That's true.
Grimm's Motel. You had to, if you were going to stay somewhere, that's where you stayed.
Right. Thank you for that, Steve. Let's start with the downtown hotel and specifically the Rumpus Room, which I love the name of that. Well, that was located at the corner of Benton and what is now Tampa Street. Is that right? Just south of Chestnut?
Well, it would be a little bit north and a little bit west of that intersection.
Okay.
Just a few feet. I mean, like.
Well, yeah. There were. I think
feet.
there were 3 houses between the corner and Alberta's.
Okay.
So there used to be a store across the street called Hunt's Market.
Okay.
And next to it was the youth center. So Alberta's place was directly across from the youth center, which I don't know what that is.
I think it's a state office building now.
Okay.
Is that
when
what
I've
it
gone
is?
by there and
Yeah.
looked, it looks like it's a state office building.
And Alberta's had once been the city hospital.
Yes, that's correct.
She got it from an auction. Is that
Right,
correct?
that's where I was born. So I ended up working where I was born.
And actually, for many blacks in Springfield, blacks and whites, they were actually born at the city hospital, which then later became Alberta's Hotel.
Yeah.
I was born at Burge,
Yeah.
and I asked my mother, I said, well, why wasn't I? Because my sister was born at the hospital, at Alberta's, and she's younger than me.
By a year.
But Mom said that there was some problem that her doctor thought she might have, so he had to get permission from Burge to have her birth there, just in case they needed the equipment that they had at Burge that they didn't have at the city hospital.
Interesting.
So that's the only reason why I was there.
Okay.
And it probably had something to do with the railroad. Interestingly enough.
Yeah.
And I say that because later, when I had my father used to work for the
Frisco?
president of the Frisco Railroad on a private car. And so I would go down to the train station with them occasionally and you know, being a kid and all, looking at all of the equipment and the building and all.
Sure.
One time I went there with him, I was about 5 or 6 years old, and they were going into the president and my father were going into the car, and I reached and grabbed the door, and when I did, I think I grabbed it with this hand, and when I did, it was a pneumatic door, so it closed on my finger, and so they couldn't hear me, you know, because of the difference in air, but they missed me, and finally they looked back and saw me, you know, flying around, and they came back and opened the door, and I'm hollering, of course, and they looked down and my finger's in there, and it's probably bleeding. I don't remember that part, but they ended up taking me to Burge Hospital, And at that time, they says, well, you know, we really don't.
Got to send them to city.
Yeah, we got to, you know, we don't really treat, you know, African Americans here or whatever. And I just remember Dad saying that the president of the railroad says, you're going to treat him, and you're going to treat him right now. And that's what happened. And so even to this day, my finger is crooked from that incident.
Wow.
One of his many accidents.
You can tell that part.
I recall an interview with your mother, Laura Cricket. Oh, I love that name. Back in 2014, where she said that even before Alberta opened the hotel and the Rumpus Room, she opened her house on Clay Street to provide young people with a safe place to gather and dance and so forth. Do you remember hearing stories about that?
Yeah, we lived that.
Yeah. Tell me about that, because that's fascinating.
Well, you know, we lived next door at 701 North Clay. And so Alberta bought the house next door. And I don't remember why she bought that house. But she did own it, and she opened up her first, what did she call it? The snack shack.
The snack shack.
There. And she provided, because it was, you know, it was like Lincoln was just right at the other end of the block and up the street on Sherman. And so kids would come there and spend their money, and she wanted to make sure everybody was safe. And so she always had rules and regulations that you had to follow. If you didn't, first she would tell your parents, you see, and then if that didn't work, she'd kind of say, look, you know, you can't come here until you get your act together. Or as she used to say, and my grandfather used to say, you know, you need to straighten up and fly right. That was a term that they used, you know. And so that's my earliest memories of her being in business was there.
So like an after school kind of place?
Well, yeah.
I mean, she sold like snacks,
Mm-hmm.
drinks, sodas, and it had a big backyard, remember?
Yeah, and people could come and sit and hang out. And,
pretty popular?
Yeah, safe, you know, and that was the main thing.
We were pretty young then, though.
Yeah, we were really young.
How many years she operated then?
I don't know.
Okay.
I can't remember because we were so young.
Did the Rumpus Room begin at the same time as the hotel, or did she introduce that later? Or
I think it all pretty much developed at the same time, and she figured out, well, okay, you know, I have the rooms and all that, but then there's this whole back wing, as we called it. There was another opportunity, and probably there were people in the community who said, hey, you know, I could use a beauty shop location for people to come to, and might as well be there. And so she worked with them, and you know, so there was a beauty shop, and then she had a barber shop. Yeah, the Pikes, another family name, were there, and then the Rumpus Room, of course, in the back.
And Moss was there too, wasn't he?
Yeah,
or were
barber.
he and Pike together?
Yeah.
Okay.
what was Pike? What was his business?
Dempsey Pike, they both were
He was
barbers.
a barber.
Both barbers.
Yeah.
And she opened that around 54, 55? Does that sound?
It had to be. 54 was when the integration came in formally in the school district. So it was operating at least by then, and maybe a little bit before
That's
then.
what I'm thinking.
You see, because I'm trying to remember.
I think she was in the phone
I would have
book.
been 10 years old, see, in 54. And it was there then, so
Okay.
it probably was a little bit before
A little
that.
bit before that.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Rumpus Room in the back of the hotel, you said it was like a wing off.
Yeah, it was like one of the
right?
bigger rooms in the back. You know, during the hospital days, I'm sure it was a ward.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was, if you can envision something that was bigger than a regular room.
Right.
Yeah.
What are your memories of how it looked, like the outside entrance? I assume was there an entrance just to the Rumpus Room?
Yeah,
You didn't have to go
no,
through
there was no separate entrance. You had to come through the hotel back door to get to the door to the Rumpus Room. And it was literally just a room.
But there was a door back there, remember? You could come from the parking lot.
Well, yeah, that's the door I was referring to.
Okay.
That's the back door at the hotel to come into.
And did that door go directly into the Rumpus Room?
No, it went into a hallway
Okay.
and then into the Rumpus
Okay.
Room, which was like in the corner of the building, within the northwest corner of the back of the hotel.
Okay. And what are your memories of how it looked on the inside when it was the Rumpus?
Well, it was just an open space, you know, more or less like a hall, and it had what we call a jukebox, you know, Victrola or whatever they call it now.
Right.
Did they have tables and chairs? Maybe just a few.
There was just a few tables and chairs.
Because people were mostly dancing.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was
there a bar?
No, I don't remember a bar.
Alcohol not served?
No.
Nope.
Nope.
Okay. Describe the clientele. Mostly locals, or was it?
Yeah,
travelers?
well, it was anybody who, if you stayed in the hotel, you could go back there. And locals, of course, came there because there were people from other places. You got to remember now, back in those days here in Springfield, most of us were related. When I turned 15 and a half and could drive, the thing that most of us wanted to do was to leave Springfield and go to Joplin, Carthage, Webb City, Neosho, Baxter Springs, Kansas, Fort Scott. We'd run the route, Ponca City, because then we had the opportunity to meet young ladies that were not related. And that was a big, big thing, to not be, around people who you were related to meet new people. So
was that the case with you as well?
No, my sister and I were younger than him. And the one thing that I remember is all the guys had cars. Like once they turned 15 and 16 years old, they all had cars. So we didn't see them after that. I mean, you saw them at the youth center because all their cars would pull up and line up, see whose car is looking the best. But I think for girls, it was different, unless you were in a car, riding in a car. Otherwise, he was the big brother. There are some things that he says he doesn't remember about us being around because he was always gone. He was always in his car or in his friend's car. So, he doesn't remember us sometimes being at the hotel.
Back at the hotel.
Back at the hotel. Because we spent every summer, after we moved to St. Louis in I think it was maybe 1958 or 59. When we moved to St. Louis, we spent every holiday in Springfield and every summer in Springfield. My sister and I, the day that school was out in St. Louis, we were on the road to Springfield, and we didn't come back until the day that it was time for school to start in St. Louis. So we kind of, we had our friends here, and they were the people that we always had known and grown up with, gone to church with, gone to school with when we were all at Lincoln or wherever schools we went to after Lincoln was no longer, Lincoln. Right.
Yeah. So dividing your time.
Yeah. Yeah. So and we had a lot more freedom in Springfield. We had the freedom to walk around, walk to the park, pick up our friends along the way.
Felt safe.
Yeah, and my mother didn't have to worry about us. Whereas in St. Louis, once mom and dad went to work, and if we were at home, it was like, don't go out the house. Or if you do, don't leave the porch. Right. Don't leave the steps. Sure. Like you couldn't go far.
Right. And did you feel safe driving around to places like Neosho and Joplin and so forth?
Well, let me put it this way. Yeah, we felt relatively safe, and I can tell you about some incidents where things were a little dicey, but overall it was pretty safe.
In another interview, we might just go into those stories.
Running the road.
I'll be respectful of your time because I could talk to you for 3 hours.
But you know what else I remember about the Rumpus Room? So we were kids, and Alberta was pretty strict. She was pretty strict with everybody. Sure. But, we were not supposed to be coming at night, poking our noses, trying to see what was going on. And if she caught us in the hallway, is like, get back to your room. You kids know you aren't supposed to be here. So she was pretty strict, and she was strict with the people who came, because if she knew that you were maybe one of the young women or men was on the parking lot in a car, she'd literally go to the car. She didn't play. Mm-hmm. And I can remember her fussing at some young lady and saying, if I see you back here again, I'm calling your mother, you know better, blah, blah, blah. That's just who Alberta was.
Well, that brings up another question about the rumpus room that I'm sort of curious about. What age groups were prominent in the rumpus room?
What is it, high school?
Yeah, maybe teenagers.
Yeah, you had to
maybe
be 16 or,
Okay, and so it was mostly younger people in the rumpus room.
or early 20s, maybe.
Yeah, and occasionally, I guess, well, when you think about it, it depended on what time and what day it was and whatnot. Like after school, you would get the kids coming in from, high school and whatnot. And, but then at night or on a weekend, you might get, folks who were staying in the hotel who came down to heard the music and wanted to come in.
And some of the soldiers from Fort Leonard were.
Right.
So they were, but they were mostly, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. There might be some older guys, but they usually were,
She was pretty strict with them too.
Oh, I'm sure she was. Yeah.
She would tell them, if you misbehave, you're not coming back to stay at the hotel.
Right.
And they didn't have any place else to go but other than Grimm's.
Right. So what, like with Fort Leonard Wood soldiers coming over, that would have been racially mixed. You'd have white.
They were.
Absolutely.
Were there any other? Were there people in the community, white people in the community, coming to the rumpus room?
Those who were associated with like the Philharmonics and the whole music community, of course.
Okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
They would not have been prevented from coming. Like
No.
if they wanted to come and they were coming with friends that were black friends, they would not have been prevented from coming.
You have to remember that the problem with those laws back in those days were it didn't make sense.
Sure.
Because I couldn't look and tell you whether you had African American blood or Indian blood or whatever. So it was very hard for us as a people to abide by the law.
Sure.
Because I couldn't tell you, I can't look at you and tell who what your lineage is.
Of course.
And that was the case back then.
Sure.
So I couldn't, there were people that I ran around with who had blonde hair and blue eyes, and they were considered to be African Americans. Right. So I couldn't tell you, and that's the way it was back then. So we never had the option of discriminating or abiding by that law because we couldn't look at you and tell what you were unless you told us.
Right. Right.
And in Springfield, from what I understand, it was more practice than legal. But you can check that out. But I think it was more the tradition or practice.
Custom. They say custom.
Yeah.
Rather than legal. But like I said, you can check that out.
I have to go back to what you were talking about with Alberta keeping strict rules and making everybody behave and so forth. I have heard that she had good conduct cards
Yes,
for
she
the
did.
rumpus room. Is that correct? So,
That is
so you
correct.
had to have a card.
You had to, yeah.
You had to be a card-carrying rumpus room member.
Well, yeah.
To some degree.
Yeah. You had to have a card.
She was
If you were
serious.
local kids, you
And
had to
that-
have permission from your parents and the whole 9 yards.
Makes sense. And so that was a way to. That's actually brilliant. Yeah.
That's what she did.
Because, she didn't want to have any problems. I mean, she didn't want to have, you think about it, you've got a lot of young people coming, they're coming to dance, have fun, or whatever. You've also maybe got soldiers coming from Fort Leonard Wood, and you might have, you might not know everybody, but you don't want to have a problem.
Sure.
So I think she was always aware that she had to pretty much make sure that things were, in order.
On the one.
Right.
And there were always tests. There were always people who would come and test
Of course.
to see if indeed everything was on the square.
Right. Yeah.
And it always was.
Yeah. And so she had to be 110% because
Always.
there's always somebody looking to see.
And that's the way we were
Find a
raised.
reason to shut it down.
Right.
Of course.
Yeah.
You mentioned canned music in the place with it. Was there live music in the rumpus room?
Occasionally, like I said, Brenda Lee and that whole group of folks
The
that
Jubilee
would,
people.
would sometimes come there because they couldn't go somewhere else and practice.
Okay.
Because they said, well, we don't allow those folks or whatever.
Right.
And so they would come there, and they knew they could always come there.
Right.
Again, we could not determine who was what, and that was not a consideration when it came to dealing with human beings.
But what amazing live entertainment to have.
You got it.
People were watching those folks on national television, and then they're playing in the back of Alberta's hotel.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's something.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. It was
But
different.
you know, she had a wall when you checked in at the hotel. The wall that was on the left side if you're facing the counter where you checked in, and it had
Below
the pictures. What do they call them? Like for the entertainers.
Promotional.
They're promotional
Flyers.
So there was a wall full of people's pictures, like, you know, Roy Hamilton.
Yeah.
Nat King Cole was on the wall, like all different kinds of entertainers that were known. Some of the different groups, like
coasters and
drifters. They were all there.
And some of those had stayed there.
Some of them had, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, some had stayed there, and some came there on their way to somewhere else, you know.
Right.
And they only stayed for a short period of time to rest and eat, you know.
Because the restaurant had really good food.
Right.
Right. There was a man who was cooking.
Rich.
It was our grandfather.
Your
Our great,
grandfather's
well,
cooking.
he was our great.
Well, yeah.
Wait a minute.
Right. But we called him Grandpa.
Yeah. Because it gets confusing. Because
Like we called Alberta.
Right.
And
but she was our grandmother. But
Right.
the person we called grandma was our great grandmother. But when you're in an extended family, because keep in mind when Irv was born, 5 generations were living.
all the way back to the
5
Civil War.
generations.
Yeah.
So the one who was called Mama was Eliza.
Yeah.
She was called Mama. So everybody called her Mama. I wasn't born.
Right.
She was born she died right after Irv, the next year after Irv was born. But, the name stuck. And so Grandma was actually our great grandmother. And Alberta was Alberta because everybody called her by her name in the family.
Yeah. And so that's what you called it.
So that's what we called her. My mother called her Alberta.
Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah. She was Alberta.
Like
Would
her mother.
that have been uncommon?
I don't know.
Beyond, I have no way of knowing. I don't know. Beyond the family, I know people today, they get confused because we start talking about Alberta and they're like, well, now, who is that? Or,
But,
or
in some
cricket,
Right.
But in some families, they think it may be disrespectful because you're not calling them by Miss this or
proper name.
but for us, that was just the name that everybody called.
Sure.
Well, it was because we lived in a multi-generational environment.
Sure.
As I was saying earlier, Mom's house was, and I call it Mom's house, was at 701 Clay. And then, Alberta's house at that time was like next door for a while. And then grandma was up on Sherman, And so, we just moved around the neighborhood. I always tell people, I said it was in the summertime, sometimes they'd say, get a salt and pepper shaker and go out and we'd roam the neighborhood. And there would be orchards, where we get apples, peaches, and grapes, and there was food everywhere.
Yeah.
We'd go out the Silver Springs Park and catch, we call them crawdads, but crawfish, and so there was food everywhere. So that's kind of what we did growing up here.
Good memories of it?
Real good memories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You was talking about the Wall of Fame there. That's interesting. African American performers stayed at the hotel, right? When they were staying at the hotel, sometimes were they playing in Springfield or were they just stopping in Springfield? Both?
Some of both. Yeah, and sometimes, well, that's that's an interesting story there because I just recently read an article in the Route 66 magazine, and it was talking about 1960 when the Kennedy and Nixon debates the first presidential debates were taking place. And it mentioned the fact that Marian Anderson, the famous singer, was she came here to perform, but she was not able to stay in the hotels here. And
Kentwood Arms.
But they never mentioned or offered her the opportunity to stay at Alberta's. But she ended up across the street from Alberta's at the community center, and they had a reception for her there, and the black community, of course, was there. And but there was no mention at all of Alberta's or the Graham's location. But then when you think about it, that was a time when she was having trouble everywhere staying.
I'm sure she was.
The Daughters of the American Revolution, of course, refused to allow her at that point to perform in Washington, D.C. And, of course, all of that changed later on. But so there was, always a problem with the law, as what we talked about earlier. It was kind of, it put everybody in between, because you didn't know, what was real from what wasn't real, or how was this going to play out and whatnot. And so you ended up with a lot of people either staying here in Springfield if there was room, because there wasn't always room in the hotel, because it was
a small hotel.
It was a small hotel, and there were always people who were there. And so you might drive into town and find out that Graham's was full, and if she was full, if Mr. Graham's, his cabins were full, he would call Alberta and say, do you have any rooms? And Alberta might say, well, I got one, or she might say, I don't have any. And so those folks would have to move on. And that's how she ended up eventually having the farm out on Old 66. And she said, well, they can go to the farm and stay if they're headed west.
Right.
If they're going east, they'll have to keep moving, but they're going to have to make it to St. Louis.
And she had rooms in the farmhouse that
Yeah.
you could stay, correct?
People could stay there.
Yeah, but I don't remember. I don't remember if there. How do I want to say this? When she was there, right? Or if
That was
Robert
her retreat.
was there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we kind of, as a family, I remember we would go there often with Alberta or with Robert. If somebody did need to stay, there were rooms there
They
that
would
they could
make
stay.
arrangements.
Right.
Okay.
Or they would say, look, you can sleep across the street in the park. And, in the morning when you get up, you can come over here, we'll fix you something to eat and get you provision to go on further west.
So as a business, it wasn't necessarily a hotel
No.
or an inn, but it sometimes served that purpose.
Right.
Because
it was
there was
evolving.
also a room, in the living room area, off the second living room area, there was a jukebox.
You're talking about at the farm?
At the farm.
Yeah.
She put a jukebox, and so they were clever, and so she also sold sandwiches or snacks or
provisions.
Okay, well then that means there must have been enough traffic.
Oh, I think so.
For her to invest in doing something like that. There must have been enough traffic coming through there and people staying.
Well, see, again, you have to remember that this was during a time when there were the migration was taking place. I'm going to call it the Great Migration. The one out of the south went north, and the one out of the south also went west.
Sure.
And so folks were leaving the south, Georgia, and Alabama, and all those places, heading for California or anywhere west to get away from where they were.
Sure.
And so there was always traffic. Bert, my mom's classmate from the old days, their final years they lived together. Bert told me one time that he had made like 30 or 40 trips by car from California back home. And he said, most of the time he drove straight through. So that would be 26 to 28 hours because he didn't know where he could stay.
Yeah.
And he would just have to keep rolling.
Right.
So there were people out there on the road constantly moving.
Right.
But also the farmers used a lot for picnics.
Yeah.
And for
retreats.
Local families who knew that the farm was there. The front yard, from the road, it
There was
a
a
long
circular drive,
driveway.
yeah.
So the front yard was pretty long. And so she put tables and chairs, picnic tables and chairs, so that people could come and have picnics and whatever on a Sunday afternoon. And then there was a farmer next door. The white farmer next door had horses. And so she arranged with the farmer to let kids have pony rides for a little bit,
Yeah.
So I just remember that, you know, that farmer cooperated and you could ride the ponies.
And Barnes store up the street. They, you know, folks pretty much worked together, you know, irrespective of anything else that was going on. You know, people here in the Ozarks are very resourceful, and they do a lot of workarounds.
Sure.
And so, you know, they worked around the law sometimes, as we all know.
Yes.
You know, so that's part of what it means to be from the Ozarks, is the ability to improvise and to make do.
Sure.
Well, Missouri was always a bellwether state. It was neither slave nor free.
Right.
So, you know, you had people on both sides of that issue. Yeah.
Sure. Right.
Still do.
Still do. Any of the musicians who were coming into town, did she ever take them out to the farm? Do you know?
Oh, they went, yeah, sure, they went there. But you got to remember now that what morphed out of that was the Crystal Palace.
And that's what I want to get to next. Crystal Palace. Why did she open the Crystal Palace?
She probably thought it was a good deal.
She probably thought it, well, again, it was on the Route 66. It was basically headed west on the old road, and there was a lot of traffic. And so there was an opportunity, you know, to open up something where she could, you know, have another opportunity at making money.
Okay, what was she, because these were running at the Rumpus Room, I think the hotel closed in 1964, I think, so the Rumpus Room.
It was after that, wasn't it?
After that?
No, that's probably pretty close to the time that it closed, 64. I can't remember now when she got sick and all that. Yeah, it was right around that time, but I don't know exactly.
Okay.
Because see, by then I was gone. I left here November the 26th. I mean, November the 22nd of 63, I left Springfield.
I think from what I've been able to tell, the Crystal Lounge opened around 1955, so they're all running at the same time.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Did she hire people to work in? Yeah, I mean, she couldn't be at two places at one time. Was she hiring people?
She never rested.
I'm sure she didn't.
No.
She really didn't. I just always remember her being busy.
And I always remember me being on call.
I bet.
Because she made him work for it, you know. It's like,
Oh yeah.
he didn't want to stay in St. Louis and go to school there, so he came back to Springfield after just a few months, and so he had to stay at the hotel. I mean, that's where you lived.
Yeah.
And Alberta's thing was, you got to work. You know, you got to earn
Well, that
your
was the
keep.
agreement that I made to come back to Springfield.
It's like, you got to earn your keep.
Yeah. Literally.
I remember somebody saying, she said, it might have been your mother, in an interview with your mother said, I'm not First National Bank.
That's right.
Oh, she would tell us that all the time. I mean, that was like standard. Because we were always, you know, I don't think we realized it. We were always asking for something. And we were always needing, you know, we need to get some money to go downtown to go shop or whatever. And she would always, you kids think I am First National Bank. I am not First National Bank. Now, a little bit later, she'd give in, you know, she'd give us something. But, you know, her first thing was, you know, it's like, hold it.
Yeah.
I am not First National Bank.
Right.
You kids think I'm First National Bank.
So, I mean, she was running.
She was First National Bank to us.
To you. She was running two establishments at the same time.
Really? Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And working full time.
And working full time at the telephone.
No telephone. Yeah.
So, what about the Crystal Lounge? I mean, was I think that opened in 1955. We saw a newspaper ad from 1955 where it had just opened. Any idea how she acquired that property?
No, I don't know how she acquired that property.
Okay.
And, you know, in our research and looking at the materials that have been left to us, we found a plat where she was planning to build something else.
A subdivision.
A subdivision, and it was already platted out. She apparently paid, you know, engineers and architects to design it. We were. It looked to us like it was down near 65 and somewhere down the James River, somewhere in that area down there.
I can take a picture.
Yeah.
We have the
still have
actual
that.
document.
Yeah. One of the things that we found.
I knew she had some rental houses, but so it makes sense that she would.
Yeah, and she
consider
had named the streets. You
Yeah.
know, some were Alberta Lane or Ellis this. So and it was notarized.
Right.
But when I went to the Record of Deeds office, you know,
Prior
they
to
said that they did not have any record of it.
Okay.
But it was notarized. It was, you know, and it had Greene County Record
And
of
it
Deeds
seals
on it.
on it,
It's
yeah.
right. Now, what I don't know, because we saw it after our mom had passed, so we didn't know if mom knew
Right.
about that document.
Okay.
Because when Alberta got sick, it was really pretty fast. I mean, I think she was only sick for about 3 months. So there was just a lot going on and a lot to deal with. And I think for my mother, I think there was really a lot for her to deal with.
Of course.
She was an only child, and Alberta was an only child.
Right.
So, but before them, there were 9.
Yeah.
Number of folks that everything sort of funneled down to those 2 people. And
Because
then,
when you think about it, Alberta basically was making sure that her aunts were taken care of.
Sure. Right.
So when she opened the hotel,
they went to work.
her mother, who we call Grandma, her mother, Ora, died shortly after that. And Margie and Stella, Ora's sisters and Alberta's aunts, were living in the Crittenden family house. So she moved everybody to the hotel.
Okay.
Stella moved to the hotel, Margie moved to the hotel, Rich moved, and Rich was married to Ora at that time. So Rich is the one who was like an excellent chef.
Yeah.
You know, but so they all moved to the hotel. She basically, I don't know, you know.
Were they working at the
Yes,
hotel?
they all
So
had
like the
responsibilities.
workforce?
Yeah.
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 Were family running the Crystal Lounge?
No, it's just her and Robert.
Just her and Robert.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you remember about the physical place, the building?
The
what did
the
it
Crystal
look like
Lounge.
inside and out?
Well, it was a single-story space, and it did have a bar in it, and it, of course, had restroom and all, all the amenities that you would need to run a facility like that.
Just a block building or a woodside?
Yeah, it was. As I remember, it was a block building,
Okay.
Cinder block building, and it didn't have a peaked roof or any of that. So it was just like, I don't even know what it was used for before, but it might have even been a service station or something like that. But I'm not sure, because it had a gravel front lot, and then there was the lot on the side that was also gravel. So, but there was no other structures outside of the place. So I don't know what that building was built for
And it
originally.
was sort of out in the country.
Yeah.
Well, at that time it
the
was.
time, yeah.
Yeah. Where the highway 40, what is that, 44,
Right.
crosses right there now. It was just to the west of there and a little bit on the south
Okay.
side. So it would have been on the south side of Route 66 as it was running west right there.
Okay.
And it was just, I don't know what was there before, because there was nothing but farmland around it.
But his job was to clean up after the weekend, remember?
That was everywhere. That was my job everywhere.
I recall one time you said, I was not old enough to go into places.
Right.
I was old enough to clean up.
I was old enough to clean it up. That's right. And that's what I did.
Yeah. So what did it look like inside?
It was just an open space, much like the building we're in now. And with a
chairs.
little low platform like this where the bands could assemble,
Right.
and play.
Tables
And
and chairs.
it had tables and chairs, along the
That
walls.
ad, I think I'm correct in saying that ad said mixers provided, which means that people, if people were having alcohol, they were bringing their own.
They had to bring their own.
They had to
Yeah.
bring their own.
Right. But
Was that just a licensing thing?
I would imagine, again, that part, I didn't get involved with that part.
Right.
But she did have what they call setups, ice,
Setups,
glasses, and
Right.
all of that. And I'm not, I really, again, I wasn't really involved with it when it was going on.
Right. Sure.
But before and afterwards, I was there. I was too young to be in with that crowd. I wasn't interested in any of that at that time.
Was she having live music out there?
Yes, she did. Yeah.
And people traveled. They came from
Yeah, like Sonny Boy Williamson, I remember him, and
Ask some of the people that
people
played.
like that. And I wasn't interested in that music. You see,
Yeah.
I was into doo-wop and rock and roll, you know,
Right.
all that.
Was it mostly just weekends, or?
Yes, it was mostly on the weekends. Yeah, it was a weekend, Friday and Saturday, you know.
Mostly travelers, or was it people
Well,
coming from Springfield?
It was Springfield people.
And maybe from some of the other little
Right.
towns.
And like local talent played there, Bebop and them, and I'm not sure, I think the Beatles even played there, David and them from time to time, yeah.
What age group was the clientele?
Well, they were older than me,
mature.
that was more mature.
They were more adults.
Yeah, because there was, you know, like I said, there was liquor, you know, so there was, had to be adults. You couldn't be
Which
in
is
there.
really interesting from her standpoint as an entrepreneur, because she had the rumpus room downtown.
For teens and younger
to the
people.
teen crowd
Right.
and the younger crowd, but then she had this that was
Right, for their
adults.
parents and,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, pretty smart.
Yeah, and there was never any trouble that I'm aware of. Never any trouble.
Racially mixed clientele?
Yes,
I think so.
always. Yeah. Because again, we couldn't tell who you were or
Right.
you know.
Well, and I think the issue was that she didn't discriminate.
No, she did not discriminate.
Like-
That's what how are you going to discriminate when you don't know what you're looking at?
Yeah.
Well, but even if you know, she didn't discriminate.
Well, that's true of her.
Yeah, I mean,
she didn't care.
if you were very white, you still were allowed.
Yeah.
They didn't
It
care.
didn't matter. It
Yeah.
didn't matter. Did they have to have a card for that one too?
No, no.
I just love that.
Yeah.
So, any names? You mentioned a few of the artists who played there.
Well, you know, it was mostly an opportunity for some, like I said, the local folks and the folks that were, known traveling through on the road. And again, as an adult, I didn't know much about.
I was just curious
all
to
them
know
folks.
if performers from the outside ever would, for instance, get in touch with Alberta somehow and say, "Hey, we're going to be there. You want us to play?"
That's what they would do.
Okay.
I know I've heard her talk about her friend Big Joe Williams, who was some big time musician out of Kansas City that used to come through, and he'd bring in his entourage, and they were friends. And so Alberta knew a lot of the very famous
Because
musicians.
she lived in Kansas City when she was in high school, so she knew people in Kansas, and they traveled a lot going back and forth to Kansas City.
Yeah, so she had musical connections in
Oh, yeah.
Kansas
Probably
City,
so.
correct?
She absolutely did, yeah.
So some of those, St. Louis too, I
Yeah,
assume?
yeah, absolutely.
And probably like Carthage, Joplin, like the areas around you would know.
The circuit,
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Oklahoma too.
Yeah.
Do you recall when it closed? When it closed?
Oh, no. See, again, I left, like I said, I left here November the 22nd of 63.
Yeah.
So the Rompus Room, I don't remember when it closed. By then I was, moving out.
And Crystal Lounge, when did it close? When
Here's-
she died, or?
My recall is I remember we were in college, and I remember Mom saying that she needed help, like to try to get some things done. So she was having to go back and forth to Springfield a lot. She was having to work with Alberta's lawyer, and I remember she made the decision to sell the farm. That if the Crystal Lounge she probably made a decision to sell that. There was just a lot that she needed.
It
to
happened really
deal with.
fast.
Yeah.
The thing that I remember the most, and this is getting back to that whole Kentwood Arms thing in 1960. I remember the end result of all that happened in 1960 here in that regard was that by 1960, I guess it'd been about 1961 to somewhere in there. We formed, in 1960, we formed the NACP Youth and College chapter here out of the Youth Center. And we threatened to picket the Kentwood Arms. The youth did. And I can remember when Alberta told me that Ray Charles was scheduled to come to Springfield to entertain that whole thing that was going on up there, but he was not going to be able to stay there. He was going to be able to play there. And I remember the conversation I had with her about that. I said, well, why is it that he's going to be allowed to play up there? but he's not going to be able to stay there. That's just not right. And some of my schoolmates, both black and white, talked about it, got together and said, you know what? We need to take a stand and make a scene, and because this is just, it's ridiculous. Here we are going to school together. It's already stupid that we can't go to the theater and sit together. When we get to the theater, it's our gang. When we get to the theater, then, because you're white, you get to sit on the first floor at the Landis Theater, and then we got to go upstairs. And that's crazy. We're going to school together. And here's this, this just doesn't make sense. So I guess today they would say we were waking up. We were becoming woke.
Right, sure.
And so we decided, all right, let's just see if we can wake them up.
Did you have conversations with Alberta?
Well, that's what I was leading up to.
Yeah.
Because Alberta said to me, when I told her what we were going to do, she says, this is going to cost you. And I said, what do you mean? She says, when people can go anywhere that their money will take them, they won't go back to the places that they used to go to all the time. They want to go to something new. She said, so that's going to cost you. She said, you're doing it for the right reason. You absolutely are. And, you go ahead and do that. If that's what you want to do, you and the NAACP youth, you do that, but it's going to cost you. But, it's like what John Lewis said, there's good trouble.
Yeah.
And that's what this was. But, it's history is really something. It's always written by the victors.
Of course.
And both sides of the story are never told. It's always the one side of the story that's told. And so this is the side that I know because I lived it, and it was personal, and I was there, and I paid the price.
Sure.
You see, I left Springfield November the 22nd, 1963, and the whole world changed from the time that I left Springfield and got to St. Louis, because that was the day that the president got killed.
Sure.
And that's a whole nother story in itself, that trip from Springfield to St. Louis that day. Was amazing.
Yeah.
When I saw and what I realized.
Another interview. Gosh. Okay, few more questions and I'm going to be done. I know I've taken up a lot of your
We'll
time.
cut it short.
This is very nice. You're very, very gracious. Alberta's establishments were listed on the Green Book,
Right.
which likely delivered African American travelers right to the doorstep.
Absolutely.
Right? Beneficial to be in
Right.
that Green Book, but also very beneficial to be on Route 66.
Mm-hmm.
I
Right.
think.
Absolutely.
That gave her a distinct advantage, especially for the music venues.
That's true.
Because she was on business Route 66.
Right. Can you imagine the musicians that travel from Chicago to LA or, any of that on Route 66 back in those days?
Sure. So
And just think, all those motels that are along Glenstone, they couldn't go there.
right, yeah. So she had a good place. She was in a good place.
She was in a good place.
And didn't realize that as she opened up the Crystal
Probably
Tavern
didn't.
on Route 66, of course. Yeah. Were there any local musicians? You mentioned this earlier. Local musicians: Dallas Bartley, Bebop Brown,
Yeah.
the Bedell family.
Right.
Any other locals you remember being a part of the circle?
Well, there were others, but again, we were so young, and
names that I
again,
know.
I was not really into,
Right. That music.
Right, that music at that time. Elvis Presley had just hit, and
yeah.
all that, and so, it became all about rock and roll for me and doo-wop music.
Chuck Berry.
Yeah, Chuck. Yeah, he came here, and his wife stayed there.
They stayed in Alberta.
Yeah.
Chuck Berry.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, he came here to go to. He came here to go to a federal hospital here, prison hospital.
Okay.
Are you sure it was Chuck Berry?
Yeah,
Okay.
it was Chuck Berry.
That
Yeah.
is amazing.
I thought
He lived in our neighborhood in St. Louis,
St. Louis.
around the corner from us.
Uh-huh.
But when she would come to visit him, she'd stay a night at the hotel.
Jeannie dated his nephew.
And then, is that right? I didn't know that. See, I wouldn't know that.
That's great.
They all went to school together.
It must have just been an amazing time to be alive.
It really was. It really was. The Harlem Globetrotters, of course.
Oh, yes, right. I've read about the Globetrotters being there. I didn't focus in on them because they're not music.
And I own one of their old tour buses. It sits beside my shop in St. Louis. Yeah, it sits beside my shop in St. Louis. And it was here in Springfield where I bought it.
Oh, that's amazing.
Right up here at the entrance to the park.
That's something.
Yeah.
Do you have any memory of Alberta or your mother going to hear other local performers or outside celebrities in Springfield? You ever?
I'm sure they did, but you know, oh yeah.
But you would have been, once again, that you would not have been the least bit interested in the music they were going to.
I was trying to get the Carthage and Joplin.
So just last question. Was music a big part of your formative years, would you say?
Well, I can't carry a tune, and I don't play an instrument at all. I enjoy all kind of music. I'd love to play the blues harp, but I've never been able to master how to do it. Now, you play piano, right?
Yeah, I played the piano, but you know, I took lessons. Yeah, I took lessons for 8 years. So, you know, but I was doing the sheet music, whatever sheet music I had, which, you know, the standards, and like, I can remember I had some Nat King Cole sheet music, just different things like that. But that was it.
That would have been fascinating to have sheet music of somebody who'd actually been in your town and stayed with you. You know, I mean, that would have been something. That would have made it much more.
But what I remember also is Mom always wanted us to be playing something, learning something. So you did the drums.
I tried to do the drums.
He did drums. I did the piano. My sister didn't want to do anything, but Mom was always like, you know, Jeannie, are you sure? Are you sure? But she just wanted to sit on the piano beside me, you know, and watch me play.
I think they had me do the drums just to occupy me.
Oh, I think so too.
I didn't have any musical talent. Still don't.
Anything we didn't cover? Touch on.
No, we were all in the marching band for Lincoln. We were majorettes.
Yeah.
I carried the flag because I couldn't play an instrument.
But you did take drum lessons.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
But nevertheless, music. I mean, as you said, you were into rock and roll. And
Right.
I mean,
Right.
It was
Early days.
Yeah,
And
it
I
was
think-
part of the landscape, a big part of the landscape.
And I think because we knew the local people, because they were always around.
Yeah.
You know, they were friends of
were at church,
family members. They were at church or whatever. We always knew who they were.
Right.
Because I think Springfield probably had a pretty active local music scene for
It did.
especially the African American players. Yeah,
Yeah.
that they had a pretty good, you know, they did okay.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this project and for talking with me and sharing your memories, because they are golden.
Well, you know, I'm going to just say one thing that I've learned through the years, and as I watched Alberta, she was a woman ahead of her time. She really was. And to think about what she was able to accomplish in really a short lifespan. Because I think she was our grandmother. I knew she didn't have any gray hair, but I never thought about how old she was. And it's not until I really looked at her death certificate, and I always thought she was in her 60s, but she was in her 50s. And I thought, wow, look at what she was able to do in a really short lifespan.
Courageous.
Yep.
Incredibly courageous.
She was amazing.
I was saying earlier that I thought, you know, she spent a lot of time creating sanctuaries for people.
That's a good way to look at that.
Who needed to be taken care of or protected, you know,
Right.
and insulated from danger, real danger.
Yeah.
Remarkable.
Yeah.
And you haven't done
Because-
so bad yourself, you know.
Well, I've taken lessons from her. It's my property. That's for sure.
That's a good lesson.
Yeah. And my daughter has taken lessons from her too. And my daughter looks a lot like my grandmother.
She does.
That must feel good.
Yeah. And Mom always thought so too, because Phyllis really, when we look at pictures of my grandmother when she was young and we look at pictures of my daughter when she, about that same age. They look alike.
Yeah, it's amazing.